Midday rain glittered on metal steps as the K9 held its nose to the tread and the Marshal froze the line with one palm. The radio crackled the hold. Phones rose to film. And the service door seam shivered once behind the dog's steady stare. A boot lifted toward the harness, and the Marshal braced his forearm in time, stopping the swing clean, inches short of contact. Earlier, hard sun cut sharp shadows as the dog tested the wet strip, refused the slick edge, and fixed on the same lower step. Minutes before, wet prints and a scuffed patch ran to the service door, and the dog held on that seam like it mattered. Midday light struck the boarding stairs like polished steel, hard and bright, showing every rivet and scuff in the tread. The air marshal held his post by the lane, eyes sliding over hands, pockets, and faces while the terminal glass threw heat back at him. Jet fuel hung under the roofline, mixed with coffee and sanitizer. Behind him, a suitcase wheel clicked twice, then stopped, and the hush that followed felt arranged. He shifted his weight and told himself the tension was only another long shift, nothing more. His eyes returned to the steps again. A service cart rolled along the perimeter road and hissed through a thin ribbon of wash water, tires whispering as if someone had tried to erase a trail. The sound traveled up the stairwell and into his ribs, a warning too small to name. He blamed the wind curling under the jet bridge housing, the kind that made doors chatter and flags snap, and he forced a slow breath. Still, his fingers brushed the radio clip, and he edged one step closer to the stairs, watching the lower tread as if it could answer him. The stillness did not feel like luck. On the lowest step, a damp smear caught the sun and flashed once, then vanished as the angle changed, leaving him unsure it had been there at all. He told himself it was spilled drink or routine cleaning, nothing worth a second look, and he almost turned away. Yet his body stayed keyed, shoulders slightly raised, as if bracing for turbulence. The heat on the back of his neck felt heavier than it should, and his mouth tasted of dry air and metal, the way it did before something broke the script and forced attention. He kept that taste as a note to himself. He paced the edge of the boarding line, boots tapping a steady rhythm, then paused by the bench near the stairs where shade pooled dark. Under it, the shadow seemed deeper than the space allowed, and a low scrape sounded like rubber on metal, too measured to be random. He held still and listened, counting breaths, refusing to let the pause become a scene. The scrape came again, followed by a soft exhale close to the floor, steady and controlled, and his forearms tightened as if the sound had brushed his skin. He stayed there a second longer than normal. A flicker of movement slid through that shadow, too compact to identify, then pressed flat and disappeared as if trained to vanish. He told himself it was a loose strap, a rolling bottle, a trick of glare and fatigue, and he tried the explanation twice. His pulse did not accept it. When he looked up, the service door beside the jet bridge trembled once, then stilled, as if someone had leaned their weight against it from the other side. He took 2 steps toward it and stopped, unwilling to manufacture trouble in public. He felt the pattern tighten around him. Outside, a vehicle braked at the curve on the service road, tires squealing sharp against wet concrete, and the sound cut clean through engine hum. At the same instant, heavy boots splashed onto the first step and sent droplets skittering down the metal like beads. The air marshal moved without thinking, closing distance in 3 quick strides and raising his hand in a small, unconscious halt. Something dropped low and slipped under the bench with practiced speed, leaving a brief swirl of dust that caught sunlight before settling. His hand stayed up until the boots passed. He reached the service door seconds too late and found wet boot prints stamped across the threshold, fresh enough to shine. The latch quivered in its frame, a faint rattle that died as he set his palm against the panel and felt it still vibrating. Near the bench, a scuffed patch of floor looked newly rubbed, as if pads had gripped for purchase on smooth tile. He crouched, scanning the gap, and kept his breathing quiet while the boarding line crept forward behind him and an announcement droned through speakers. He rose slowly, saving the detail for later. From under the bench, a pair of dark, steady eyes reflected the light for an instant, then blinked away. A handler's boot shifted nearby, and a short lead tightened, keeping the hidden presence controlled and close. The air marshal straightened and stepped back to avoid crowding the space, returning to his mark as if nothing had happened. Yet his gaze kept sliding down to the bench, and the unease stayed anchored there. Something watchful was already guarding the stairs, unnamed, and it was waiting for the next move. He walked on, but the bench kept his attention. By the next boarding window, he watched the clock more than the passengers. The same service cart passed at the same minute. The same hiss of water on concrete reached the stairs, and the same service door gave a brief tremor as if answering. He logged it in his head like a sequence of cues, then told himself he was overfitting, meaning to routine. Even so, he walked the perimeter of the lane instead of holding still, pulling closer to the base of the stairs when the minute arrived. He noted the minute again and waited for the next cue. On a short break, he stepped into the staff corridor where the air turned cooler and smelled of printer toner. A map of gates hung crooked on the wall, and a security bulletin fluttered when the AC cycled. He replayed the pattern in silence. Water, door, scrape, then that compressed movement under the bench. He tried to dismiss it as maintenance quirks and fatigue, the kind that made a man invent threats. When he returned to the gate, he kept his radio low and his eyes on the bench. He left the corridor with the thought still lodged in his throat. The first hint came before the team even reached the lane. A faint tick of nails on tile, then a controlled pause near the bench. A short lead slid against a handler's glove, quiet as a whisper, and the air marshal saw the handler stop without being told. The presence beside the handler stayed low and still, hidden by legs and luggage, yet the air changed around it. The marshal watched that disciplined stillness and felt himself start to mirror it, waiting for what the bench might reveal. That focus narrowed, and he felt himself narrow with it. The handler stepped into the open, and a German Shepherd Police K9 came with him at a controlled heel, leash short and quiet. Ears high, mouth closed. The dog ignored the crowd and aimed its nose toward the boarding stairs as if pulled by a line. At the first step, it drew a long breath and shifted its paws to straddle the damp strip without stepping into it. The air marshal had seen teams like this for years, but this precision felt personal, and he marked the lower tread as the center of gravity. The pause held the line in place a fraction longer. No one else seemed to notice. The K9's eyes locked on the lower tread, then flicked once toward the bench, then back again, making the connection with unsettling clarity. The handler offered a soft cue to move on, but the dog held, reading scent the way a person read print. A gate agent frowned at the delay and tapped a tablet, and the air marshal leaned in to smooth it over with a low voice. He called it nothing. Just a stray scent line or a wild thing passing through the service lane, and he hated how thin the phrase sounded. He kept the phrase in his head and wished it away. The team shifted toward the bench, and the shadow beneath it answered with a measured scrape that never rose to panic. The air marshal crouched at a respectful distance, scanning the floor line for anything displaced. and found a fresh scuff and a thin thread of dampness. It led toward the service door beside the jet bridge housing, as if something had been carried on a boot sole and stamped there. He decided not to touch anything until he had a cleaner angle, and he kept the boarding flow moving with small hand signals. The room looked calm, but the stillness felt staged. He crossed to the service door and set his hand near the latch without touching it, listening for vibration through the metal. The panel stayed quiet, yet the smell of wet concrete mixed with paper and adhesive was stronger here than it should have been. He stepped back and nodded to the handler to hold position, then flagged a ground worker to slow carts on the curve outside. The worker shrugged but complied, and the air marshal felt the first small shift of control return. His radio stayed silent, but his plan started to form. He kept his voice even. When boarding resumed, an impatient passenger tried to squeeze past the K9 team at the base of the stairs, shoulder angled to slip through. The air marshal stepped between them in one calm move, palm raised in a clear stop, body blocking the path without force. He redirected the passenger with a low voice and held the line until space opened again, keeping attention on crowd pressure. Beside him, the German shepherd stayed planted, gaze fixed on the lower step as if guarding a single point. The marshal felt the moment rehearsing something worse, and he cleared the stairs for the next cue. After the gate cleared, the air marshal walked with the handler into a quiet operations office away from the public glass. Fluorescent light softened the midday glare, and the sound of rolling bags fell to a distant murmur. The German shepherd lay on a rubber mat by the door, head up, tracking every movement without moving a paw. The handler spoke in practical terms, but the dog's restraint carried its own history. The marshal listened and watched the dog's ears tilt at every mention of stairs and paper. The dog exhaled once, then held, listening with him. The handler pulled up training notes on a terminal computer and pointed to entries about odor work tied to documents. Paper, ink, adhesive, and the oils from hands created signatures the dog could separate in a crowd. The marshal remembered the K9's nose hovering over the lower tread and understood the attention was not whim. The German shepherd remained still, but its nostrils worked steadily, tasting air that drifted under the office door. That quiet focus made the marshal feel exposed, as if he carried traces he could not see. He kept his hands still, letting the dog work the air. The story moved backward into harder seasons. Highway shoulders in sleet, field exercises near drainage canals, long hours in empty parking structures where wind turned every smell into a lie. The dog had learned to ignore raised voices and sudden motion, to wait for a cue and then commit without hesitation. The marshal pictured the animal running a line along wet asphalt, nose down, tail steady, while traffic hissed past. He saw why slick surfaces made the dog cautious now. Not afraid, but exact, testing traction before trust. There had been one incident, the handler said, where a training scenario went wrong in a small way that left a large memory. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Watching the marshal with a steady grin, unsentimental stare. A scar line showed faintly under the fur near one wrist, and the handler mentioned a slip on black ice during a vehicle stop years back. The injury had healed, but the memory remained in the way the dog tested footing before committing. The marshal saw the caution as discipline, not weakness. Procedures had shaped the dog's trust as much as weather. A previous handler had been reassigned suddenly. Paperwork signed. The familiar scent gone from the unit car without ceremony. The German Shepherd continued to work, but it held people at a careful distance, offering competence before comfort. The Marshal recognized that posture, the professional calm that concealed a bruise no one named. He watched the dog accept the current handler's touch with tolerance rather than need, and he understood why letting go was hard. It stayed with him. On the perimeter road, he stopped at the curve where the service vehicle had braked, watching a puddle dry into a pale ring. Tire marks cut through the damp like thin signatures, and he imagined scent pooling there before lifting toward the stairs. The German Shepherd worked to the edge of the pavement on a short lead, nose sweeping low, then paused at the exact point where rubber met wet concrete. The Marshal did not speak. He let the dog have the moment, seeing in its stillness the same warning he had felt in his ribs. He marked it. In silence. That evening, off duty, the Marshal sat on his apartment porch with a glass of water sweating in his hand. Street noise drifted up from the road, and a distant siren rose and fell like a slow breath. In the quiet between sounds, he thought of the boarding pass that had seemed to appear from nowhere and the damp strip that should have dried. He checked his schedule for the next day and felt a tug of reluctance. Not fear, but responsibility. In his mind, the German Shepherd's fixed gaze on the step became a kind of request. The next morning, he returned early and reviewed surveillance angles with a supervisor, staying within protocol and keeping the discussion small. The footage showed only fragments: the handler's boots, the bench shadow, the service door's brief vibration, and a white rectangle sliding where no hand was visible. His chest tightened at the sight, because the movement was too intentional to be wind. He pictured the German Shepherd tracking that rectangle, deciding it mattered, then choosing the stairs as its post for the day. He saved the timestamp. By midday, the German Shepherd was back at the gate, body squared toward the stairs as if assigned by something older than orders. The Marshal stood nearby, pretending to monitor the lane while his attention stayed anchored to the lower tread. The dog kept returning to that same point, guarding, waiting, refusing to let the pattern drift away. The Marshal realized he could not fully open to what it implied and still do his job with ease. Yet he also could not walk away. The present was stuck, and the dog was holding it there. The air marshal arrived earlier than his roster required and walked the gate area before boarding began, counting steps from the bench to the first stair. The German Shepherd waited with the handler near a service pillar, still as a statue, until the Marshal lifted his hand in a small acknowledgement. A breeze rolled off the tarmac, carrying warm rubber and a faint note of adhesive. He watched the stairs and saw the damp strip already forming again, thin and stubborn. He did not call it coincidence anymore, not even to himself. Today, to keep the scene controlled, he spoke with the gate agent in a side alcove, setting expectations without raising alarms. The agent wanted speed and clean metrics, and the Marshal answered with policy and calm, buying minutes with measured words. Over the agent's shoulder, the dog's ears pivoted toward the stairs as a service cart hissed outside. The Marshal felt the old pressure behind his ribs, but now it came with purpose. He returned to the lane and widened the buffer space at the base of the steps, using stanchions and body position. He kept his tone level and let the clock do the arguing. When the boarding group approached, the German Shepherd moved first, not pulling, just advancing with intent. At the lowest step, it stopped and angled its body across the path, blocking the incline with a disciplined stillness. The handler offered a cue to continue, and the dog refused to cross the wet strip, testing traction with one paw and then holding, Passengers slowed, irritation rising in a low wave, and the marshal stepped forward, palm raised, intercepting the surge before it could crowd the dog on slick metal. He spoke quietly, and the line obeyed. He redirected people to the side, keeping them off the metal stairs, and the dog held its block as if guarding a line no one else could see. A ground worker tried to push a cart past the curve too fast, and the marshal snapped a firm order to slow down, voice low but final. The worker bristled, then complied when the marshal pointed to the wet tread and the crowd's proximity. The dog never broke focus. It stared down at the lower step as if waiting for something to appear, and the marshal kept his stance anchored. The marshal stayed between Boots and the dog, holding space. A white rectangle fluttered from a passenger's pocket near the first step and landed on the metal tread with a soft slap. The boarding pass bent slightly, catching sunlight. Barcode block visible but unreadable at this distance. The German Shepherd stepped forward, nose hovering inches above the paper, and inhaled with a slow, deliberate pull. Its ears stayed pricked, eyes intense, and the posture tightened into alert stillness. The marshal saw the exact shape of the moment forming, down to the angle of the stairs and the crowd behind him, and he did not let it rush. The handler reached to retrieve the paper, but the dog shifted, placing one paw near the edge of the pass and holding position without touching it. The marshal raised his palm toward the line and kept the crowd back, using his body as a barrier while his other hand steadied the radio against his chest. The gate agent protested about delays, and the marshal answered with a single sentence about safety and authority, ending the argument clean. The dog's nose traced the barcode area again, then lifted, waiting. It did not relax. The marshal held steady. He took an evidence bag from his kit and, with the handler's nod, slid the boarding pass inside without contaminating it. The German Shepherd remained on the first step, guarding the damp strip in the paper's former spot as if the absence still held scent. The marshal signaled a ground supervisor to keep vehicles off the curve, then directed the agent to pause, scanning for 1 minute. The pause was small but real, a commitment made in daylight with witnesses. He kept his voice even and his movement slow, protecting the dog from both haste and slipping feet. In a break room off the corridor, he made a quick call to the airport security desk, describing only what he could prove. A repeated pattern, a K9 focus point, and a document that drew a clear response. The desk pushed back with procedure and questions about disrupting operations, and he answered with timestamps and the supervisor's name from his badge card. He felt the weight of official pressure settling in, heavy as the heat outside. When he ended the call, the dog's nails clicked once on tile behind him, a quiet reminder that time did not pause for paperwork. Back at the gate, he took a position on the boarding stairs just below the dog, close enough to shield it if the crowd surged or a cart skidded. The German Shepherd stayed composed, but its muscles remained coiled, ready to brace on slick metal. The marshal kept one hand raised to stop movement and used the other to radio a simple instruction to ground crews. Hold the service road clear at the curve. The air felt tighter, as if everyone sensed a change without knowing its cause. He did not touch the dog, but he stayed beside it, choosing presence over comfort. The radio crackled with a reply from security, the voice clipped and formal, and the marshal felt the floor shift under his plan. He kept his palm up, eyes on the crowd, and planted his boots on the stair tread so the dog would not be jostled on slick metal. Behind him, the handler tightened the lead just enough to keep the German Shepherd steady. ready to pull it back if a cart or shoulder surged too close. The marshal listened as the order came through, with no room for interpretation, then pressed the transmit button to acknowledge. Hold the flight at this gate until further notice. Static cracked in the air Marshal's ear, and the order repeated, clipped and formal. Hold the flight. He stayed one step below the German Shepherd, palm raised to the boarding line, boots planted on wet metal. The dog's nose hovered where the pass had been, ears rigid, eyes narrowed on the lower tread. Behind glass, the jet bridge door blinked with reflected sun, and impatience thickened into murmurs. He drew a slow breath and kept his stance, buying seconds that felt expensive. He watched the dog's stillness and felt his own hands steady, even as phones rose in the line. The gate agent pressed close with a tablet angled like an accusation, jaw set on on-time numbers. The air marshal answered with policy and a small nod toward the K9 team, keeping his voice low so it did not ignite the room. The handler shortened the lid a fraction to steady the dog on the slick strip. Outside, a service vehicle whined through the curve, too fast, and the dog's head snapped toward the sound. The marshal lifted his radio and signaled for the perimeter to slow down now. The handler's boot shifted, careful on the wet tile, and the dog did not blink. Wind shifted under the terminal roof and carried the scent of rain before the sky changed color. The German Shepherd's posture tightened, paws testing traction twice without stepping forward. The handler murmured a cue. The dog did not break focus, only angled its body across the base of the stairs again, blocking the incline. A passenger tried to shoulder past the stanchion, crowding the dog's flank, and the air marshal stepped in, turning the surge aside with a firm hand and a quieter voice. He widened his shoulders like a gate, keeping boots away from the dog's ribs and the wet step. Outside, the service cart hit the wet patch at the curve and fishtailed, tires squealing, its rear swinging toward the gate lane. The air marshal moved off the stairs in 2 fast strides, arm outstretched to signal stop, body braced between the cart's path and the K9. The driver corrected and rolled to a shaky halt, water spraying the pavement in a thin fan. The dog stayed steady, eyes hard on the curve as if it had predicted the slide, and heads finally turned. He heard sharp breaths behind him, then the hush of people realizing the ramp could turn dangerous. Ground crew gathered near the lane, voices tight with irritation about delays and sudden commands. The air marshal kept his tone even, pointing to the wet stair tread and the crowd's proximity, making safety sound like routine, not fear. The handler guided the German Shepherd down 1 step, then back up, checking footing and keeping the dog away from bodies. The dog's nose swept the lower rail, then froze on the service door seam, and the marshal followed that line with his eyes. The seam quivered once, subtle, and the dog's nostrils flared as if the air itself had changed. The evidence bag with the bent boarding pass sat in the air, Marshal's hand like a small weight. The barcode block, smeared but intact, caught sunlight, and the German Shepherd lifted its nose toward it from 2 feet away. The dog exhaled once, controlled, then returned its gaze to the stair tread where the paper had landed. That loop paper to step to door repeated with mechanical insistence. He tilted the bag a few degrees, and the dog tracked the motion without shifting its feet. His glove stayed dry, but the dog's focus made the air feel close, and he kept the bag out of impatient hands. Airport security pushed through with fast steps and stern faces, demanding the bag and a reason to freeze an aircraft. The air marshal gave the timestamp and the pattern, tight and factual, and kept his body between the crowd and the K9. The handler stayed silent, but the dog's stance spoke, still blocking the stairs as if the incline itself mattered. A supervisor's eyes flicked to the wet strip, then to the dog, and his argument softened into a single request for next steps. When security hinted the dog should be pulled back for speed, the marshal shook his head and held the buffer line. A scanner beeped when the gate agent tested the barcode, and the screen flashed a mismatch, canceled and reissued. The air marshal watched confidence drain into caution. Passengers shifted, suddenly attentive to pockets and papers. The German shepherd leaned forward once, nose tracking a tight scent line across the stair base toward the boarding group, then froze. The handler tightened the lead, and the marshal felt the danger move from paper to people. The dog's tail stayed level. No theatrics. Only a silent insistence that tightened the handler's grip. The dog's head moved like a compass needle, stopping on one pair of shoes, sliding away, then returning as if pulled back. The passenger's hands stayed too still, pass clutched too hard, eyes locked on the jet bridge door. The air marshal stepped closer, palm raised to stop forward movement, and matched each sideways shuffle with his own. He kept distance between the person and the K9 on slick metal, refusing to let impatience become contact. A heel scraped tile near the dog's paws, and the marshal shifted again, shoulders wide, keeping boots away from slick metal. Thunder rolled far off, soft but unmistakable, and the terminal light seemed to dull despite the sun. The German shepherd blocked the stairs with sharper urgency, then dropped its nose to the service door threshold and inhaled hard. Security wanted the line diverted. Operations wanted the plane moved before weather closed the ramp. The air marshal stared at the vibrating seam, thumb hovering over the radio, and chose the smaller door over the larger schedule. The first fine drops tapped the rail and darkened the tread, and he could feel traction disappearing under the dog's feet. He ordered the gate agent to hold scanning and directed security to clear the stair base, creating a wide circle of empty tile. The crowd protested, but his posture did not change, and the handler kept the dog steady, paws square, eyes forward. A maintenance worker arrived with keys and a wary glance at the K9, waiting for permission to touch the latch. The marshal nodded and lifted the evidence bag for the dog to scent, and the German shepherd's ears sharpened, ready to move first. He took the lower step, palm up, stop gesture, making the stairs his responsibility before the dog moved. The service door opened on a narrow maintenance passage, cool and dim compared to the glare outside. Water dripped somewhere unseen, steady as a metronome against metal. The German shepherd leaned into the lead, controlled but insistent, nose low to the threshold, then lifted to taste the air inside. The air marshal stepped over the damp line first, boots placed carefully so the dog would not slip behind him. The flight would not move until this choice played out, and he went in anyway. Ventilation fans hummed behind the wall, carrying paper scent, and the dog pulled forward with purpose. The maintenance passage smelled of damp concrete and warm wiring. The air marshal kept his pace slow, one hand on the rail, the other holding his radio low so it would not echo. The German shepherd worked ahead on a short lead, nose sweeping the floor seam, then lifting to a wall vent as if scent climbed. Water dripped from a pipe joint and darkened the ground in small circles. Behind them, gate noise blurred into a distant roar, and he placed each step as if the corridor could turn slick without warning. The dog's nails clicked once, then went silent as it listened. The dog stopped at a junction where the passage met the stairwell frame and pressed its nose to a bolt plate, inhaling hard. The handler crouched, checked footing, then held the lead steady while the air marshal angled his flashlight down. A thin smear of adhesive glistened on the metal, and paper fibers clung to it like lint. The marshal's jaw tightened. It matched the faint trail the dog had carried from the boarding stairs. He marked the spot with a glove and radioed for a controlled pause at the gate. A maintenance cart sat parked in the passage, mop bucket half full, leaving the floor slick in a way that could put the dog down fast. The air marshal dragged the cart back by its handle and laid a rubber mat from the supply rack to give traction. The German Shepherd stepped onto the mat without breaking focus, nails clicking once, then resumed the tight scent line along the wall. The handler's breathing stayed calm, but his knuckles whitened on the lead. The marshal kept his body close to the dog's shoulder, ready to brace if it slipped. From the gate, a shout rose, followed by the scrape of shoes as someone pushed against the cleared circle. The air marshal caught it through his earpiece and pivoted toward the door, posture already bracing. The German Shepherd froze mid-step, ears pricked, then turned its head toward the noise, guarding its working space without sound. The handler shortened the lead and backed the dog into the safest corner of the passage, away from wet concrete. The marshal moved to the doorway, knowing crowd pressure could become a blunt instrument. The passenger who had drawn the dog's compass stare surged through the gap, face flushed, hands out, claiming the delay was nonsense. In the same motion, the person's boot lifted toward the German Shepherd, a sharp, impatient kick meant to clear the path. The air marshal stepped in and took the space, forearm blocking the leg cleanly while his other hand rose in the stop gesture. The boot never landed. It met the marshal's braced stance and stopped. The dog stayed steady, eyes locked, and the handler kept the lead tight. The moment held in full view, and it changed the room. Security grabbed the passenger's elbow and pulled them back into the brighter gate area. Voices clipped but controlled. The air marshal kept his palm up until the space was wide again, then glanced down to check the dog's paws for slip or strain. The German Shepherd blinked once and returned its nose to the threshold line, choosing work over reaction. The handler gave a low cue and the dog complied, calm, restoring itself in posture. The marshal felt a belief turn. The danger was not abstract, and protecting the dog was part of protecting the flight. Back in the passage, the German Shepherd led to the wall vent and planted, then scratched once, precise and deliberate. The handler held the lead short while the air marshal knelt and shone his light through the grill. Behind the slats sat a folded wad of paper pressed into place with tape, edges damp, fibers frayed. The marshal slipped on fresh gloves, used a small tool from the maintenance kit, and eased the bundle free without tearing it. The dog's nose hovered over his hands, tracking every movement with disciplined patience. The outer layer was a torn boarding pass sleeve, barcode block smeared in the same way as the one in the evidence bag. Inside it, a small plastic pouch held a dark, granular material and a cheap heating pad, the kind that could warm on contact and release odor into air. The air marshal did not name it. He sealed it in a second bag and radioed for the airport response team, voice flat. The handler guided the German Shepherd back onto the rubber mat, away from the bundle's drift. The marshal felt the flight's hold become permanent and necessary. When the response team arrived at the gate, the air marshal returned to the boarding stairs with the German Shepherd at heel, recreating the scene in daylight for control. Rain had begun in fine sheets, turning the metal tread slick and bright. A boarding pass lay on the lower stair where an officer placed it for reference. Barcode block visible but unreadable. The dog stepped up. Nose down. Intense eyes visible. Ears high. The marshal moved to the right side. One hand raised in stop. The other holding his radio close to his chest. Holding the crowd back with his stance. The German Shepherd sniffed the barcode area once. Then snapped its head toward the service door with a firm, unmistakable line of intent. The handler followed that line and stopped the dog at the threshold, confirming the same loop the marshal had watched for days. The marshal angled his body to shield the dog from the boarding crowd and the wet stair edge, ready to catch a slip. A gust drove rain sideways and made the rail cold under his palm. He felt the animal's weight shift and steadied it without touching, holding space like a barrier. Operations accepted the hold when the response team confirmed the find, and the jet bridge door stayed shut. Passengers were redirected in controlled groups, irritation draining into reluctant compliance as security explained, a safety pause. The air marshal watched the German Shepherd settle into a sit on the mat, chest rising slow, focus still locked on the stairbase. The handler offered a small drink from a squeeze bottle, checking gums and breathing with practiced calm, and the marshal felt the crisis easing. He stayed beside the dog, ready to catch a slip if the wet tread shifted again. In the quiet after, the air marshal stood beside the German Shepherd at the base of the boarding stairs, rain easing into mist on the tarmac. The evidence bag sat sealed in a clear bin, barcode blocks visible but unreadable, a reminder that one piece of paper had stopped an entire aircraft. The dog leaned forward once, then relaxed, work complete, and the marshal let a hand rest briefly on the harness strap, gratitude expressed through restraint. Over the radio, the final confirmation came: flight canceled for inspection. Gate secure, and the marshal exhaled into a calm that held. The next day's shift began in the operations office with paperwork instead of sirens. The air marshal wrote the report in clean language. Wet tread. Repeated pattern. Document mismatch. Hold issued. Through the open door, the German Shepherd paced once, then settled on a mat, ears working with every footfall in the corridor. The handler checked paw pads for soreness from slick metal, then clipped the lead with the same quiet precision as always. The marshal felt steadier, as if the day had taught his attention where to stand. A non-slip runner appeared on the boarding stairs before the next boarding window, laid down by maintenance without comment. The air marshal watched the German Shepherd step onto it and relax a fraction, traction changing the dog's silhouette. He walked the perimeter road himself and posted a slow sign at the curve where the cart had slid, then used his radio to enforce it for the first hour. Ground crew grumbled, but the near miss was fresh enough to keep them honest. The dog's nose swept the lower rail once, then returned to neutral, and the marshal noted the difference. In the break room, the gate agent offered a stiff apology without theatrics, eyes on the coffee machine. The air marshal accepted it with a nod and did not press for warmth. Procedure mattered more than pride. The German Shepherd lay at the handler's feet, head up, tracking each opening door, then exhaling when the room stayed calm. A few staff asked to see the mat setup and the stop position on the stairs, and the marshal demonstrated with small, practiced movements. The handler clipped a towel to the crate door, and the dog's eyes followed the motion, steady and patient. Outside by the service road, rainwater collected in shallow channels along the curb, reflecting the aircraft fuselage in broken pieces. The German Shepherd worked a short training sweep along the edge, nose low, then lifted its head toward the curve and held there, testing wind. The handler praised with a brief touch on the shoulder, then moved on, keeping the work clean and bounded. The air marshal noted how the dog no longer tensed at every tire hiss. It had a safer lane now. That small change made the whole gate feel less brittle. At home that evening, he sat on the porch and listened to distant engines rise and fall beyond the neighborhood roofs. The day's images returned in fragments. A boot lifting, a palm raised, wet metal under a working body. His phone buzzed with a short message from security about revised gate procedures, and he saved it without celebration. In the quiet, he realized his job had always been to hold space between crowds and danger, between urgency and care, and the German Shepherd had simply made that truth visible. He set his phone down and let the idea settle. In the parking structure before dawn, the handler walked the German Shepherd past rows of cars, letting the dog practice ignoring old scents and sudden noise. The air marshal watched from a respectful distance as the dog checked the ground once, then lifted its nose to work the air. A suitcase clattered on concrete, and the dog did not flinch. The handler angled the lead, rode the elevator up, and returned toward the gate with calm that looked earned. At the top level, wind funneled through the ramps, and the dog paused to listen before stepping back into the terminal flow. By midday, the boarding stairs had become a controlled ritual. Mat down, buffer line set, perimeter road slowed, radios clear. The German Shepherd took its position, ears up, eyes scanning, then sat when cued, ready but not strained. The air marshal stood to the right, stop gesture rehearsed but relaxed, and watched passengers move with a little more distance around the working team. The animal's presence was no longer an interruption. It was part of the place's rhythm. He checked the wet tread out of habit, then let his shoulders drop, trusting the new pattern. Weeks later, the air marshal stood in the small briefing room while a supervisor reviewed the incident in plain, unsentimental terms. A laminated copy of the smeared barcode block sat clipped to the board as a training reminder, not a trophy. The German Shepherd lay near the doorway on its mat, eyes open, listening to the cadence of voices the way it listened to footsteps at the gate. When the supervisor spoke about early pattern recognition, the marshal felt his earlier doubts loosen and fall away. The lesson had a shape now, and it stayed. At the gate, midday light returned and the boarding stairs shone dry for once, the non-slip runner in place like it had always been there. The German Shepherd climbed one step, paused, then sat on cue, scanning without strain. The air marshal took his familiar position on the right, radio at his chest, palm relaxed at his side until needed. A passenger dropped a paper by accident, and the dog only glanced at it before returning to the wider space, no longer trapped by that single point of tension. The marshal watched the restraint and felt a quiet respect deepen into something steadier. In a quiet corridor, the handler brushed loose fur from the dog's harness and shook out a towel. Small motions that kept working bodies ready. The air marshal helped fold the runner at the end of boarding and stored it with the same care he once reserved for paperwork. Their coordination never turned sentimental, but it did turn reliable, like a practiced handshake in motion. The German Shepherd leaned briefly into the handler's leg, then faced the door again, content to guard without drama. The marshal carried the folded runner down the hall and understood what routine could protect. One afternoon, a ground worker slowed at the service road curve without being told, tires rolling gentle through a shallow puddle. The air marshal watched from the rail and remembered the moment water had made metal dangerous, and how quickly a crowd could forget traction. The German Shepherd stood beside him, ears up, nose testing the air, then relaxed when the vehicle passed clean. The Marshal did not need the memory to sting anymore. It served instead as a quiet guide. The dog's steady presence made that choice feel permanent. That evening on his porch, engines droned faintly beyond the neighborhood, and rain tapped the railing in an easy rhythm. The air marshal set his keys down beside a small issued tag from the K9 unit, a simple marker of a day that had changed his attention. He thought of the German shepherd on the boarding stairs, intense eyes on a bent piece of paper, and of a raised palm holding the world back long enough for safety to catch up. In the quiet, the story felt less like drama and more like duty kept well.
If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.